Hi, and welcome back to Mr. Raymond's Social Studies Academy for our final lesson on the Civil War. Now, this has been an introduction to this monumental war, one designed to cover what you will need to know for your state tests and classes, but one in which we've only scratched the surface. So I hope at some point you will spend much more time with what was one of the most transformative events in U.S. history. Previously, we looked at how, despite growing political opposition, Lincoln was secured a second term by Union victories, especially General Sherman's capture of Atlanta. How in 1864 and 1865, General Ulysses S. Grant, utilizing the North's superior numbers and resources, wore down General Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, and we left off with the surrender of Robert E. Lee to Ulysses S. Grant, two of the most legendary generals in U.S. history, at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. And today we're going to provide a brief overview of some of the ways this war would change not just the country, but the world in ways that we are still feeling today. Reviewing some of the impacts of this war will help you put it into a larger context for your classes and tests as far as writing essays. And just a reminder, teachers, that this PowerPoint with a variety of resources are available at Teachers Pay Teachers. Just click the link in the notes below this video or search for Mr. Raymond's Social Studies Academy at Teachers Pay Teachers. As we stated before, this was the deadliest war in U.S. history, with close to 600,000 killed in action. In many senses, the Civil War was one of the first modern wars in U.S. history, as more deadly and accurate weapons, such as machine guns and rifles, would change the way wars were fought. No longer would large armies line up across from each other on the field of battle and fire at close range. It was also the first U.S. war to use the telegraph to relay instant orders and updates, and the railroad to transport troops and supplies. The use of ironclad ships and the first submarines would radically change navies. The war also had a huge impact on the expanded role of the federal government. The size of the bureaucracy of government officials had grown exponentially to handle the massive war effort, one that would never return to its pre-war levels. It also confirmed the supremacy of the federal government over state governments, as we will learn more about in our next lesson on Reconstruction. The debate over states' rights to nullify federal laws or secede from the Union was forever settled, and a greater sense of nationalism gripped not only the United States, but the entire world. President Lincoln had taken on unprecedented executive powers, greatly expanding the reach of the presidency. And Congress, without Southern opposition, passed many new laws that would help expand the United States and its industrial future. The Legal Tender Act authorized the creation of paper money known as greenbacks that were not redeemable for gold or silver, just as our money is today. The Pacific Railway Act of 1862 for the development of transcontinental railroads, which, as we will see, would open up Western lands for future development. To entice new settlers to the West, Congress created the Homestead Act, granting 160 acres of basically free land to anyone who would live on it for 5 years, greatly expanding the population of the Western territories. The Morrill land grant gave states proceeds from the sale of public lands to create colleges and universities. And the North, while at times experiencing some economic issues with the loss of Southern customers to their consumer goods, ultimately saw a commercial explosion as the production of war goods helped grow their industrial base. Many new companies and corporations got rich from supplying goods to the Union Army. Unfortunately, there was also a rise in corruption and fraud, as some of them knowingly sold shoddy goods to the U.S. government. Women in both the North and South played a much more active and public role during the war than previously imaginable. Thousands of women signed up for volunteer brigades and served as nurses. In the North, women organized what were called ladies' aid societies to supply the Union soldiers with food and clothing. In 1861, they persuaded the government to create the United States Sanitary Commission to prevent disease and infections in the Army camps and hospitals. Activist Dorothea Dix became the superintendent of Army nurses, and the pioneering Civil War nurse Clara Barton would go on to create the American Red Cross. Death from disease accounted for around 2/3 of all the soldiers who died in the Civil War. Antiseptic practices were virtually unknown at the start of the war. However, nurses and doctors began putting sanitary practices in place during the war, which would help launch the modern medical movement. Southern women played an equally active role in providing aid to the Confederate Army, and many were thrust into the role of running their farms and plantations, and both in the North and South in running family businesses. The war would play a large role in expanding the burgeoning women's rights movement, which we will learn more about in upcoming lessons. The North had been spared much of the destruction that took place in the South, as most of the fighting happened there. Entire cities and much of the farmland laid in ruins, which would cripple the South for generations. We will look at the rebuilding of the South in our next lesson in what's called Reconstruction. Of course, the most monumental outcome of the war was the emancipation of the slaves in the United States. It wasn't until campaigning for re-election in 1864 that President Lincoln gave his full support for the total emancipation of the slaves. Lincoln and radical Republicans had begun calling for a constitutional amendment outlawing the practice of slavery towards the end of the war. The 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, was passed by the Senate in April of 1864 and the House of Representatives in January of 1865. However, it would still need to be ratified by the states. We'll talk about the passage of the 13th Amendment in our next lesson, but it would be impossible to talk about the outcomes of the Civil War without acknowledging the fact that it freed around 4 million slaves, ending more than 250 years of slavery in North America. As the war came to an end, the major question facing the government was how to readmit the southern states into the Union. Of course, this was something that had not been considered when the U.S. Constitution was drafted. As Commander-in-Chief of the Army, Lincoln felt it was the president's duty to decide how to handle what would ultimately become called Reconstruction. After his re-election, Lincoln had considered letting the South re-enter the Union and then vote on the 13th Amendment. In his second inaugural address, Lincoln spoke of the need to reunite the country, quote, with malice towards none and charity for all. However, the radical Republicans in Congress were not feeling quite as forgiving and were prepared to challenge the president on his plan for readmitting southern states into the Union. Unfortunately, on April 14, 1865, while attending a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., Lincoln was assassinated by actor and Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth, just 5 days after General Lee had surrendered his forces. President Lincoln's casket was brought to the Capitol, where mourners paid their respects, as the North went from a state of celebration over the end of the war to one of mourning. Tens of thousands lined the railroad tracks used to carry him to his final resting place in Springfield, Illinois. Southerners' responses to the president's death were mixed. The freed slaves were devastated, but many Confederates celebrated. However, many also worried how this would affect the North's response to Reconstruction, which is where we'll pick up next time. But before we do, let's review. What impacts did the Civil War have? Well, it expanded the central government, it changed the ways that wars were fought, created a greater sense of nationalism, and expanded the northern industrialization. It provided a greater public role for women and led to better medical practices, and of course, it ended slavery. What laws were the unopposed Northern Republicans able to pass during the war? The Legal Tender Act, the Pacific Railway Act, the Homestead Act, and the Morrill Land Grant. The Legal Tender Act created what? Paper money called greenbacks. This act gave settlers free land. The Homestead Act. What role did women play during the war? They served as nurses, formed aid societies, and ran the family farms or businesses. This famous nurse would go on to start the American Red Cross, Clara Barton. This amendment ended slavery, the 13th. The period that followed the Civil War, where the South was rebuilt, was known as Reconstruction. And that's it. I want to thank you guys for watching. Be sure to subscribe because up next we are going to look at Reconstruction. And just a reminder, teachers, that this PowerPoint with worksheets, guided notes for flipped class videos, Kahoots, lesson plans, quizzes, and additional activities are available at Teachers Pay Teachers. Just click the link in the notes below this video or search for Mr. Raymond's Social Studies Academy at Teachers Pay Teachers. Once again, thanks for watching, guys. Keep up that good work.